In the mid-80s, the Škoda Stelle or Type 742 was looking about as trendy as an Austin Maxi, and it was about as old. The original car it was based on launched in 1969. But Škoda didn't want to go the same way as other Eastern Bloc and Russian car companies with their increasingly out-of-date products that were suffering from a severe lack of finances. They needed a new car that didn't just look modern, it was modern underneath. The result was the Škoda Favorit, a car that Autocar magazine has described as the most important car in Czech history. And important it was, because without this car, Škoda as a brand may not still exist, along with car production in Czechia. Just how did Škoda produce something so modern despite no money, and how much did it contribute to their bright future? This is the Škoda Favorit story. Škoda had its roots repairing bicycles in the 1890s, but soon they became a well-respected vehicle manufacturer. After the Second World War, they were stifled by a communist leadership with its planned economy. Their cars fell behind Western competition, but that didn't stop Škoda from punching above their weight. They won the Monte Carlo Rally in the 1300cc class in 1977, despite their rear-engined cars being out of date. What Škoda needed was a mainstream car to compete with the West, a practical 5-door hatchback with front-wheel drive. That configuration produced a car with more interior space that was lighter, so it went faster and it was more fuel efficient, and it was cheaper to boot. Škoda reached out to East German car makers Trabant and Wartburg to pool resources for such a vehicle, but they were rebuffed. There was also an attempt to build a version of this new car in Ukraine to help offset development costs, but that didn't happen either. Škoda would have to go it alone and somehow find the development cash. Styling work began in the late 1970s with a modern 5-door hatchback design, and decision makers were shown a prototype. But it would take until the end of 1982 until the green light was given to produce the car. And of course, once the decision was taken, those decision makers wanted it produced as soon as possible. They stipulated that development should only take 2.5 years and production should start within 5 years. Oh, and build a factory to produce it in the process. That was quick but doable in the West, but for a company lacking funds and out of practice making new cars and lacking the people and tools to do the work, this was bordering on impossible. But Czechoslovakia needed a new car to bring in Western currency to prop up the failing economy. Škoda's 1982 prototype had far too many issues: the chassis, the engine and the styling. The Czech car maker needed outside help. And so in March 1983, Škoda representatives went to the Geneva Motor Show. They approached Italdesign, but that company wasn't keen after Škoda had failed to produce their 720 and 760 designs in the 1970s. Why do the work when the new car would never see the light of day? In any case, Italdesign were bound by Japanese contracts. Likewise, Pininfarina had an exclusive agreement with Peugeot. But they found a willing partner in Bertoni, the stylist of the Fiat X19, and a company not known for family hatchbacks. The closest they'd come of late was the 1974 Innocente Mini, an Austin Mini with a hatchback body that BL considered but ultimately rejected bringing to the UK as a mini update. By the time of the contract signing in June 1983, Nuccio Bertone had already created several sketches to get the ball rolling. By September, Škoda representatives visited Italy, where they got to see a scale model of the new car. By the end of the year, there was a full-scale model. Despite it being shorter than the Estelle, it had more room inside thanks to that front-engine, front-wheel drive layout. It looked the part, but underneath the new car was actually an evolution of the 1970s Estelle. The engine was a larger 1.3-litre version of the Estelle engine, and it would see immediate use in the 1984 update to that car. But the engine needed more than just a size increase. European laws required cleaner burning engines that ran on unleaded fuel. There was talk of ditching Škoda's engine and licensing one from Volkswagen, but for financial reasons the two sides could never come to an agreement. In the end, the decision was taken to make significant changes to the existing engine to reduce both emissions and consumption. They also soundproofed the exhaust to comply with new EU rules. That soundproofing was done in collaboration with Porsche, again spending more precious Western currency. Škoda employed them primarily to work on the engine suspension and front axle geometry to upgrade it to more modern standards. Škoda might get outside help, but they did significant work on the chassis themselves, and they reduced the number of body parts from 405 on the old Estelle down to 227. To make sure Škoda's car would cut it, the new car was compared to stiff competition, the new Fiat Uno and the new Volkswagen Golf. Whilst designing the car, Bertone ran into roadblocks trying to produce the intended vision, thanks to Czechoslovakia's planned economy. He wanted the car to have only one front windscreen wiper, but Škoda's existing contracts called for their cars to have two, so two it had to be. It was the same with many other parts of the car, and that led to many compromises. By 1986, the design was set, production was getting ready, and Škoda testers were driving the car to all parts of Europe, like the frozen Alps and the warm Italian Riviera, to make sure their new people's car was as good as it could be, covering 93,000 miles in the process. It went incognito, so no snooping eyes would get wise to Bertone's exciting new shape. It had to pass EU crash tests as well, and thankfully the major tests went without a hitch. The only problems found were minor and were easily corrected. The car's name was chosen by a Pole, a very communist and egalitarian way of making the choice. But rather than Kari McCarface, the public decided the best name was the Favorit, probably because the Czech word was almost the same in English, Spanish and Scandinavian languages. Škoda and all of Czechoslovakia hoped it would be many people's favourite car. The Škoda Favorit launched in 1987 at the Brno Engineering Fair in Czechoslovakia. The public interest was intense. The fair drew double the attendees of the previous year. Škoda produced this presentation video, although the fake ore this guy is showing makes you think he'd never seen a car before. I mean, yes, it's a new car, but it's no Lamborghini Countach. But although the car had gone public, production hit one problem after another. By the end of 1987, only 200 cars had been produced. It would take over a year until full-scale production started. With Western customers waiting for it to arrive, demand for Škoda's existing cars collapsed, leading to further financial chaos for the Czech carmaker. Once the Favorit had eventually made it to the UK, Car Magazine reviewed it against an entry-level Ford Fiesta. After all, they were both around the same price. The big downsides of the Favorit were the brakes, ride and handling. As Car Magazine said, however long Porsche spent working on the Favorit suspension, it clearly wasn't long enough. It was a softer suspension, and that may have been because it worked a lot better on the uneven roads in Czechoslovakia. But then again, the Favorit offered a lot more than the Fiesta. It had a bigger engine, 1.3 litre versus 1 litre, meaning acceleration was light years ahead. 60 miles an hour was achieved in around 14 seconds compared to the Fiesta's nearly 22. That larger engine meant it fell down in fuel economy though, despite the 5-speed gearbox. It was larger inside as well, and you could remove the rear seats entirely to carry a wealth of cargo. The Favorit got a good level of equipment: rear doors, a clock, rear headrests, a tilting glass sunroof, stereo radio cassette, and not one, but 2 door mirrors remotely adjustable from the inside. But you need to crank that radio cassette up to drown out the rattles and creaks that came from the dashboard. It was clear Ford had spent 6 times more developing the Fiesta. Škoda and their suppliers were years behind in the production of plastics, and it showed. They were making the same mistakes that other car producers had made in the 1970s. They were using the same old-fashioned materials, like man-made fibres, on seats that were so lauded a decade earlier. The quality of the car wasn't up to the Fiesta, but it wasn't that far off, and many thought the extra features were worth making the switch. After all, a Fiesta with those specs cost another £1,000. And to assuage fears that the Favorit would leave you stranded, Škoda offered a 2-year unlimited mileage warranty, more than could be said for the Fiesta. But whilst you might save money buying a Favorit, there was a social price to pay. You'd be the butt of many a Škoda joke from your friends. The Favorit was well received, particularly its styling, so you'd think Bertone would be happy. But the company wasn't. They designed a 4-door saloon and a 3-door coupe that were ready to go. The 4-door saloon got as far as 2 working cars in 1986, with folding rear seats for additional practicality. The 3-door coupe was still being worked on into 1987. There was even a prototype of the Tremp, a fun utility vehicle, but none of these would make it to market. All that styling and development work would go to waste. The reason was that Škoda was far too impoverished, and in any case in the late 1980s, small saloons were yesterday's news, and why buy a 3-door when you could buy a 5-door? Škoda had to concentrate on cars that would sell. But they could always try to drum up some extra business to get the funding to produce those other versions. Škoda asked the Czech police if they wanted an estate. Yes was the answer, very much so. They needed somewhere to put their police dogs. What's more, an estate was easy to create from the existing hatchback. It was revealed as the Škoda Tourist in 1989 and went on sale a year later, offering a very practical car. The wheelbase didn't change, but the whole car was 35 centimetres longer, providing bags of cargo space. In the UK, it was the Favorit Estate, but would eventually be renamed in many parts of the world as the Škoda Foreman. It was easy to remove the rear windows and turn the Foreman into a delivery van, which was marketed as a 2-seat Practic. Another practical shape was a pickup, and relatively easy to produce. Just hack off the bodywork, find some new taillights and firm up the rear suspension. And so the imaginatively titled Škoda Pickup was offered for sale in 1991. It wasn't all work and no play though. Czech motorsports company Metalex crafted a Favorit open top as the 1990 MTX Roadster. It got up-spec'd over the regular car with central locking and electric windows. It might be fun, but not many were prepared to pay for one, and only 200 cars were ever made. After interest from Switzerland, Škoda produced an EV version of the Favorit and pickup as the Elmo in 1991, also known as the Eltra. Like other electric cars from the 1980s that used lead-acid batteries and motors that weren't optimized for cars, performance wasn't that great. The top speed was 50 miles an hour with a best case range of 50 miles. The weight of the batteries meant that the pickup's load capacity had to be reduced. There were a few sales across Europe, but demand was never strong and production only lasted for a couple of years. The Favorit launched with Czechoslovakia under communist dictatorship rule. The car's arrival was a big deal. People waited outside dealers in sleeping bags to be the first to order one. They then had to wait months for delivery, such was the lack of supply from the planned economy. Cries for reform in Poland brought the first cracks in Russia's iron-fisted control of the Eastern Bloc. By November 1989, it had spread to Czechoslovakia, with thousands packing the enormous Wenceslas Square in Prague, jingling their keys, both to demand the release of political prisoners and to announce to the administration, "Goodbye, it's time to go." The communist dictatorship fell peacefully in what became known as the Velvet Revolution. Czechoslovakia and Škoda were now free to chart a new course. Škoda had plans for a new modern factory. There was an updated 1.3 litre engine and a new 1.6 litre version. Bertone was styling an updated Favorit. But with no money, Škoda would be hard-pressed to chart a course on its own. It needed a partner. Volkswagen's sales continued to grow through the 1980s, and with the fall of the Eastern Bloc dictatorships, there was interest in partnering with those car companies, principally for their factories and workforce who were already adept at car production. Given the proximity of the Škoda factory to the newly unified Germany, it was natural that Volkswagen would look at the historic Czech car maker. But VW wasn't a shoo-in. The Czech government wanted to not only retain Škoda jobs, but also continue investment in the Czech economy. They didn't want to produce some old hand-me-down Western cars, and they didn't want the loss of the Škoda brand. Volkswagen's offer was the best of the bunch. There were promises of considerable investment, but also to continue Favorit production and keep the Škoda brand, and importantly, retain the research and development centre. Volkswagen had in fact already evaluated the Favorit back in 1988 when the car was launched. What they saw was a car company very much like their own, focused on high quality, affordable, mass-produced vehicles through engineering excellence. Given this, a deal was secured in 1991 and Volkswagen took a 30% minority stake. The Favorit was likely a major reason VW decided to fight so hard to take a stake in and ultimately own Škoda. Despite delays and finances, the Favorit was a good car, decently built. Decently built was nice, but it could be better. For example, there were rust problems with early cars. So that's where Volkswagen focused its initial effort, in improving the quality of the car with investment and expertise. During this time, the car got one obvious change. The badge moved to the middle of the bonnet. But there were more other necessary compliance changes like adding a catalytic converter and fuel injection. Some Volkswagen parts also started to creep into the car. Škoda produced special editions of the Favorit to drum up sales, including the Sport model in 1992. This was no GTI. In fact, it was in no way sporty. No increase in power, no uprated brakes, no tweaked suspension. The only way you could tell it was sporty was it had different wheels and sporty seats, and it was red. A more substantial facelift for the Favorit arrived in 1993. Škoda were at pains to point out all their changes with an advert that stuck little flags all over the car where improvements had been made. To be honest, it didn't look much different inside and out, but safety improvements like reinforced doors were a welcome change. As a fitting tribute to Škoda's rising fortunes, two Favorits finished first and second in the under 1300cc class in that year's Monte Carlo Rally, just like they had in the 70s. And to underline Škoda were still kings of rallying, the Favorit won the FIA 2-litre World Rally Cup in 1994, despite only having a 1.3-litre engine. A much larger Favorit update was in the works, and it launched in 1995 as the Škoda Felicia. It might look like a new car, but underneath it was the Favorit with a lot of changes, including finally a larger engine as well as a diesel. In just 7 years, Škoda produced a phenomenal 780-odd thousand Favorits. That's over 110,000 cars every year. And those Favorit owners found that buying a Škoda was a good deal, cheap, reliable motoring. And it was only getting better under Volkswagen. Škoda might not now be the master of its own destiny, but jobs were not only secured but increasing. Pay packets were also increasing, and the company was producing better cars than ever before. The Favorit is a car that's still well loved in Czechia today, so it's maybe not a surprise that Škoda styled a modern-day reinterpretation of the Favorit in 2025. Not intended for production, this is merely a nod to Škoda's glorious past. Car Magazine did a fine job summing up the Favorit. They said, when Škoda launched the Favorit earlier this year, the jokes stopped. It was time for everyone to take the Czech company seriously. The Favorit is to my mind the best car to come out of the Eastern Bloc in the 80s. Škoda was smart to use Bertone, creating a car that looked modern and appealing. The Favorit was seemingly funded with hopes and promises because cold hard cash was running dry. That's a testament to the Škoda engineers that found a way to put such a good car together, and Volkswagen clearly saw an advantage in having those people working for them. The Favorit is an example of how to make a car on a shoestring budget, with one hand tied behind your back. Keep your eyes on the prize, make something that's possible to build but good quality, and if you're lucky, your project will turn out as well as the Favorit. If you want to see the history of Škoda from its roots as a bicycle repair shop to today making over 900,000 cars a year, there's a video on the right. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.